Something unprecedented happened in 2025. While global tourism hit record highs, 80 million more people traveling internationally than the year before, the United States was the only country on the planet to see international visitor spending decline. 4 million fewer foreign visitors, more than $8 billion in lost spending. These are the top 10 US vacation spots that are empty, and why no one's visiting America. Number 10. Portland, Oregon. Portland has always had a complicated relationship with its own image, but in 2025, its tourism numbers added a new complication to the conversation. The city is projected to see an 18.3% decline in overnight international visitors for the year, one of the sharpest drops of any mid-size American city. Portland's particular vulnerability is geographic. It sits close enough to the Canadian border that Canadian travelers have historically made up a substantial portion of its international visitor base. When Canadian tourism to the United States collapsed in 2025, driven by anger over tariffs, rhetorical provocations about annexation, and a grassroots boycott that gathered real momentum across Canadian provinces, border-adjacent cities like Portland felt it immediately and directly. Portland's downtown was already fighting a significant perception problem heading into 2025. Years of national coverage about homelessness, public drug use following Oregon's experimental decriminalization policy, and a wave of business closures in the city center had generated a national narrative that made even domestic visitors more hesitant than they might otherwise have been. In 2024, Measure 110, the decriminalization policy, was partially rolled back after data showed it had not produced the outcomes its advocates had hoped for. But the perception damage had accumulated across years of coverage that traveled far beyond Oregon's borders. Combine a struggling local image with the Canadian boycott, and Portland's tourism industry finds itself absorbing blows from two distinct directions simultaneously. The Canadian visitors who once crossed the border for Portland's food scene, its bookshops, its reputation as a laid-back Pacific Northwest alternative to Seattle, they largely stayed home. The national media representation of Portland made domestic visitors from other parts of the country more cautious. The restaurants, boutique hotels, and small tourism businesses that depend on those international visitors have limited cushion for that kind of cumulative hit. Portland is still a genuinely interesting city with real things to offer visitors. The 2025 numbers reflect a story that is more complicated than any single headline captured. Number 9. Miami and South Florida. Miami International Airport recorded a 1.3% decline in international arrivals in the year-to-date through January 2025. That sounds modest until you understand what's behind it. The Canadians who used to fill South Florida's hotels from December through March, the snowbirds who have made an annual ritual of escaping Canadian winters for Florida sunshine for decades, started staying home in 2025. Canada has historically been one of Florida's largest international tourism markets. Canadians came for months at a time, rented condos, patronized restaurants, spent money on golf, on entertainment, on the whole infrastructure of South Florida's winter economy. When 23% of Canadian travelers canceled previously planned U.S. trips in 2025, according to a Longwoods International Tracking study, Florida felt that in its occupancy rates and its restaurant receipts and its rental markets. The broader Florida story is a 6% drop in international tourism for the state overall, with the hardest losses coming from Canada, Europe, and Latin America. That 6% figure sounds manageable in isolation. It is not manageable in context. International visitors to the United States stay significantly longer, spend significantly more per day, and generate higher revenue per tourist than domestic drive market visitors. Florida's tourism economy was built in substantial part on the assumption that this particular segment, wealthy Europeans, Latin American families, and Canadian snowbirds with months of Florida winter planned, would keep arriving. When they stop arriving, domestic tourists who stay for long weekends and book budget hotel rooms do not fill the gap in any meaningful financial sense. Miami's beaches are still there. The Florida sun has not changed. South Beach looks the same as it did in 2022. What changed is the political climate in Washington, and South Florida is absorbing the economic consequences of a national policy environment it did not design and cannot modify on its own. Local tourism boards have launched campaigns trying to assure international visitors that Florida remains welcoming. Whether international visitors who have already redirected their plans to Mexico, the Caribbean, or Southern Europe feel sufficiently convinced to reverse course is a question the 2026 numbers will answer. Number 8. San Francisco, California. San Francisco had already spent several years managing a challenging narrative: high-profile retail closures, concerns about public safety, and a downtown that post-pandemic remote work had partially hollowed out. In 2025, declining international tourism compounded every existing problem. California as a whole saw an 8% decline in international tourists in 2025, with Los Angeles and San Francisco absorbing the majority of that loss. For San Francisco specifically, the Asian tourism market, visitors from China, Japan, South Korea, and other Pacific Rim countries who have historically made the city a primary American destination, has been particularly slow to return to pre-pandemic levels and showed further softening in 2025. The city's position as a gateway city for Pacific travelers made it more exposed to this specific decline than most American destinations. Beyond the numbers, San Francisco faces a reputational recovery challenge that transcends any single visitor market or any single year's data. Viral content documenting the city's downtown difficulties, empty storefronts, open-air drug use, tent encampments, circulated internationally throughout 2024 and 2025, reaching audiences in Europe and Asia who had never visited but were forming impressions from their phones. Local tourism boards have limited tools to counter content that has already been shared millions of times. Official campaigns promoting the city's beauty and culture compete against a very different kind of coverage that has a significant head start. Hotels in Soma and around Union Square reported weaker performance. The iconic experiences remain intact. Fisherman's Wharf, Alcatraz, the cable cars, the Golden Gate Bridge in the morning fog, and they are genuinely spectacular for those who show up. The problem is not that San Francisco has nothing to offer. The problem is that international visitors for whom San Francisco had been a lifetime bucket list destination are now weighing it against alternatives that come without the accompanying narrative of urban distress. Japan, Italy, Canada's Pacific Coast, New Zealand, the competition for the international bucket list dollar has never been more intense, and San Francisco entered 2025 carrying more baggage than it has in decades. Number 7. Los Angeles, California. Los Angeles entered 2025 in crisis mode. The catastrophic wildfires of January 2025 devastated communities across the Los Angeles area, destroyed thousands of structures, and generated international news coverage that created a global perception problem the city was wholly unprepared to manage. Even areas of Los Angeles that were completely unaffected by the fires saw international cancellations from visitors who, watching footage of burning hillsides from overseas, reasonably concluded that Los Angeles was not a safe destination at that moment. One business owner documented by CNN described a sharp decline in visitors compounded by what they called misperceptions about the fire's geographic scope. Visitors canceling trips to parts of the city that had never been near any fire line. That is not a rational response, exactly, but it is an entirely human one, and the tourism industry has limited tools for correcting international misperceptions once they have formed. Los Angeles was already dealing with an 8% decline in international arrivals from Asia and Europe before the fires added a second complicating factor. International visitors from China and Japan, historically among the highest-spending tourist segments in Southern California, had been slow to return to pre-pandemic levels and showed additional softening in 2025. Hollywood, Universal Studios, the Getty, the Santa Monica Pier, and the broader entertainment tourism infrastructure that makes LA an international bucket list destination all absorbed the impact. The U.S. Travel Association and California's tourism officials pushed back publicly against the narrative, with messaging emphasizing that the fires affected specific communities and that the vast majority of Los Angeles's attractions were operating normally. That messaging is factually accurate. Malibu is not downtown Hollywood. The areas that burned are not Disneyland or Venice Beach or the Hollywood Walk of Fame. But the international visitor who watched hours of wildfire coverage from a living room in Tokyo or Dusseldorf and decided that Los Angeles was on fire is not generally in a frame of mind to engage with detailed geographic nuance. Tourism economies are vulnerable to perception in ways that few other industries match, and 2025 demonstrated that vulnerability in expensive terms. Number 6. America's national parks. This one is slightly different from the others on this list because it is not a single location. It is an entire category of American tourism that spent 2025 being actively made less accessible to international visitors. The proposed introduction of a $250 entry fee for non-resident visitors to U.S. national parks, on top of the already existing per-vehicle fees, generated significant international coverage and considerable international resistance. International visitors to American national parks have historically been the most valuable tourism segment in terms of per-day spending. They travel longer distances, stay longer, and spend more per day than domestic visitors. They are precisely the market segment that a country experiencing a tourism decline cannot afford to be alienating. The policy proposal, whether or not it was ultimately implemented in full, carried its own cost before a single fee was collected. The news coverage of the proposal reached international audiences who were already reconsidering U.S. travel for other reasons and gave them one more concrete reason to point their travel plans toward Canada, New Zealand, or the national parks of Scandinavia and Iceland instead. There was also the matter of social media checks, a proposal requiring international visitors to provide 5 years of social media history as a condition of entry. The combination of a $250 parks fee on top of existing entry fees, a $250 visa integrity fee on top of standard processing fees, and the prospect of handing over years of social media activity before being allowed into Yosemite is a lot of friction to add to a vacation decision. People have options: Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, the Great Smoky Mountains, Yosemite, Bryce Canyon. These are not just American icons. They are among the most recognized natural landmarks on Earth. International visitors who chose American national parks in previous years were making a specific decision to experience something irreplaceable. In 2025, a meaningful number of them decided that the irreplaceable experience wasn't worth the accumulating friction that surrounded it. The parks themselves didn't change. The process of getting to them became visibly more complicated, more expensive, and more uncertain, and that was enough. Number 5. Seattle, Washington. Seattle recorded a 26.9% drop in overnight international visitors in 2025, the steepest decline of any major American city by some measures, and a number that reflects the city's specific geographic and economic exposure. No major American city outside Niagara Falls is more directly dependent on Canadian tourism than Seattle. Canadians from British Columbia cross the border routinely for shopping, sports events, concerts, medical tourism, and leisure travel. The Canadian boycott of U.S. travel hit Seattle earlier and harder than it hit cities further south. Canadian credit card spending in Seattle and the broader Pacific Northwest collapsed in ways that showed up immediately in hotel occupancy, restaurant revenue, and transit numbers. Businesses near the border, particularly in areas that had built specific services around the Canadian visitor market, duty-free retail, border-crossing hospitality, restaurants that had positioned themselves toward day trippers from British Columbia, reported visible and measurable losses. The decline was not evenly distributed across Seattle's tourism economy. High-end hotels with diverse international clientele were affected differently from businesses whose entire model was built on the specific Canadian weekend visitor who drives down from Vancouver. But across the sector, the numbers were clear. The Canadian visitor had not simply reduced their spending. In many cases, they had redirected their travel to Europe or Mexico or simply stayed in Canada. Seattle's Tourism Authority launched a campaign specifically designed to woo Canadians back with deals and discounts, which is a reasonable response to a specific and identifiable problem. It is also a telling one. Offering discounts to a market that previously came without them is what you do when the political context around your country has changed the value proposition of visiting it. The product, Seattle's food scene, its cultural institutions, its Pacific Northwest landscapes, has not changed. What changed is how Canadians feel about spending money in America right now, and no discount campaign fully addresses that. Number 4. Niagara Falls, New York. No destination in America has a more direct, unambiguous, and painful data point to show for the Canadian tourism decline than Niagara Falls, New York. On July 4th, 2025, Independence Day, traditionally one of the highest traffic days for cross-border visitors, Canadian car crossings at Niagara Falls were down 20% compared to the same day in 2024. The irony of the date is not subtle. Niagara Falls, New York, has spent decades trying to recover from its post-industrial collapse. The city lost half its population after manufacturing left in the 1970s and 1980s. 1 in 5 residents lives below the poverty line. The tourist infrastructure is concentrated in a narrow corridor near the falls, and the city's economic math depends on cross-border visitors choosing the American side over the Canadian side, a choice that Canadian visitors had historically made with reasonable frequency. In 2025, upstate New York as a whole saw approximately 3 million fewer Canadian visitors compared to 2024, according to New York Governor Kathy Hochul's office. For Niagara Falls specifically, where Canadian visitors are not merely a segment of the market, but the engine of much of the local tourism economy, that number lands with a different weight than it does in a city that has other economic anchors to rely on. Niagara Falls, New York does not. The structural problem for Niagara Falls is one of optics as much as economics. The falls themselves are shared between the two countries, but the Canadian side of Niagara Falls has invested in its tourism infrastructure in ways that the American side has not been able to match. The Canadian side has a skyline of resort hotels, a casino strip, an observation tower, and a well-maintained pedestrian zone. The American side has the falls, genuinely spectacular, arguably the better vantage point on the American Falls themselves, surrounded by a city that reflects decades of economic contraction. The visitor who arrives expecting to stay on the American side and finds limited accommodation quality and an economically distressed surrounding city is making a mental note for next time. In 2025, there were far fewer visitors making that mental note because far fewer Canadians were crossing at all. The falls are still spectacular. The Canadian side of the river is visible from the American side and is as developed as ever. The American side is still working out how to close a gap that existed long before 2025 made it considerably wider. Number 3, Orlando, Florida. Orlando is one of the most visited cities on Earth, and even it could not escape 2025 without meaningful damage. The city saw a 3.4% drop in Canadian visitors in the first quarter of 2025 alone, falling from 1.269 million to 1.227 million. Overseas visitors also declined slightly in the same period. For a tourism economy of Orlando's scale, fractions of percentage points translate directly into thousands of fewer hotel room nights and millions in reduced spending. Walt Disney World is the most visited theme park complex in the world. In Disney's own quarterly earnings calls during 2025, executives acknowledged what they called continued softness in international visitation, noting that domestic theme park attendance dropped 1% during one quarter, partly attributable to the international decline. When Disney World, the most powerful individual brand in American tourism, is publicly acknowledging softer international numbers, the scale of the broader problem becomes clear. The compounding factor for Orlando is that its entire tourism model depends disproportionately on high-spending international visitors. The families from Brazil, the UK, Germany, and Australia, who fly in specifically for Walt Disney World and Universal Studios, book on-site resort rooms, buy multi-day park hopper tickets, eat every meal on property, and spend per day at a rate that domestic drive market visitors simply do not match. These visitors plan their trips a year in advance. They spend months anticipating them. They spend money at a rate that makes them enormously valuable to the park's revenue per guest metrics. Losing a meaningful portion of that segment while domestic tourism holds relatively steady produces exactly the kind of financial pressure that does not show up in headline attendance figures, but shows up unmistakably in quarterly earnings calls. Disney said it quietly but publicly in their 2025 earnings. Domestic attendance was down 1%, reflecting, in part, continued softness in international visitation. 1% of Walt Disney World's annual attendance is not a small number in absolute terms. For the park's financial model, the composition of that attendance matters as much as the total count. Fewer Brazilian families staying on site for 10 days costs the resort differently than fewer Florida residents taking a day trip from Tampa. Number 2, New York City. New York City in 2025 led the United States in tourism decline by one of the most direct measurements available: international arrivals. The city expected approximately 2 million fewer international visitors than the previous year, a 17% drop in overseas arrivals that translated directly into an estimated $4 billion loss in tourism spending. Some analyses placed the potential revenue impact at $6 billion in direct losses, with multiplier effects. The ripple of that spending through hotels, restaurants, retail, transportation, and entertainment, bringing the total economic impact considerably higher still. A 25% decline in international tourism, which some projections considered possible under continued pressure, was estimated to cost the 5 boroughs up to $9 billion in combined direct and indirect effects. New York City's tourism economy is among the most international of any American city. Roughly 12.1 million of the city's approximately 64 million total annual visitors are international, a smaller percentage than many assume, but a segment that spends at disproportionately high rates, stays longer, and fills the premium hotel rooms and restaurant tables that generate the highest revenue per visitor. Losing a significant share of that segment changes the financial picture of the entire industry, even when overall visitor numbers look relatively stable. New York is the most prominent American city on the global stage, and its tourism numbers function as something close to a leading indicator for the entire country's international appeal. When potential visitors in Germany, France, India, Australia, and Japan, countries that have historically sent significant numbers of tourists to the United States, decide to redirect their travel plans to Europe, Japan, or elsewhere, New York is where that decision registers first and most visibly. The reasons are layered, and none of them have an easy fix. The political and immigration climate in the United States in 2025 generated international news coverage that reached audiences who had been planning American vacations and gave them reason to reconsider, and in many cases, to redirect their plans entirely. If you're a foreigner now, what you're absorbing about the United States is a dysfunctional government, ICE raids, Americans being killed, crime everywhere, said Juliet Kayyem, faculty chair of the Homeland Security Project at the Harvard Kennedy School, in an interview with CNN. That is a specific, concentrated perception problem that no tourism campaign can outspend. A strong US dollar reduced the purchasing power of European and Asian visitors, making an already expensive American trip even more expensive in relative terms. Visa processing complications, longer wait times, new fees, the prospect of social media reviews as a condition of entry added friction to the decision to visit. Countries that compete with the US for international visitors have been investing in making their own entry processes easier, not harder. Against that backdrop, the international visitor choosing between New York and Paris or Tokyo is making a calculation that increasingly does not favor the American option at the price and hassle level it currently requires. New York City's tourism board understood the trend and worked actively to counter it. The tools available to a local tourism board when the factors driving decline are national policy decisions are, by definition, limited. You cannot discount a country's political environment with a hotel promotion. Number 1, Las Vegas, Nevada. Las Vegas is the single most concentrated example of what 2025's tourism decline actually looks like in practice. The place where the abstract statistics of international visitor decline became concrete enough that the city ran its first ever citywide discount sale. The city experienced a 9.8% drop in international air traffic in June 2025 alone, the steepest decline of any American city tracked in that dataset. Separate analyses put the overall international tourism decline in Nevada at 7.5 to 11.3% for the year, depending on the metric and the measurement period. The city had priced itself at a premium during the post-pandemic years of strong demand. Resort fees, the mandatory daily charges tacked onto hotel room rates that Las Vegas properties had been adding and increasing for years, had become a significant pain point for visitors who felt they were being charged twice for amenities they had already paid for. When demand softened, those fees remained. The combination of a more expensive destination and a less welcoming national political environment proved, for many international travelers, to be a sufficiently discouraging set of signals. Canada is Las Vegas's single largest source of international visitors, according to the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority, more than Europe, more than Asia, more than any other country. In 2025, 1,196,300 Canadians visited Las Vegas, a 17% decrease from the previous year. The Las Vegas mayor described the drop in Canadian demand as going from a faucet to a drip. Local operators described hotel lobbies that had been reliably busy as eerily quiet. In September 2025, Las Vegas ran its first-ever citywide sale in response, a systematic effort to offer discounts and attract visitors who had been deterred by high room rates, resort fees, and the general premium pricing that Las Vegas had adopted during the post-pandemic boom years. The sale was a tacit acknowledgement of something the industry had been reluctant to state directly. Las Vegas had raised its prices during the years of strong demand and had not lowered them fast enough when that demand began softening. The broader picture is this. In 2025, while 80 million additional people traveled internationally compared to the year before, the United States saw 4 million fewer international visitors, lost more than $8 billion in visitor spending, and became the only country among 184 measured by the World Travel and Tourism Council to see international visitor spending decline. UTTC's April 2026 press release put it directly. Global travelers were traveling more than ever. They were simply choosing other destinations. "We used to be a country that others wanted to emulate," said Juliette Kayyem of the Harvard Kennedy School. "That narrative no longer exists. That is a significant thing for a country whose global influence has always been built on something more than military or economic power. A concept sometimes called soft power, meaning the capacity to attract and persuade rather than to compel. Tourism is not just an economic sector. It is the mechanism by which the rest of the world forms a direct, unmediated understanding of what America actually is, as opposed to what it claims to be. The international visitor who spends 2 weeks in New York, Chicago, and the national parks goes home with a personal experience that no amount of news coverage can fully displace. 4 million fewer visitors in 2025 is 4 million fewer people who formed that direct impression. That is the dimension of this story that the spending figures don't fully capture, and it is the one with the longest tail. Whether 2026 and the FIFA World Cup reverse these trends remains to be seen. Tournament-related visitors typically book hotels and travel months or years in advance, and the hotel associations in 3 World Cup host cities, New York, Philadelphia, and San Francisco, told Forbes in 2026 that they had not seen the international surge in bookings that the event was supposed to generate. The World Cup may help. It may not be sufficient. What is already established is the size of the hole that needs filling. 4 million fewer visitors, $8 billion in lost spending. The only country in the world, out of 184 measured, to see international tourism spending decline in a year when global travel hit record highs. And the reasons the hole opened: a combination of political rhetoric, immigration policy perception, new fees and barriers to entry, a Canadian boycott that drew on genuine national grievance, and an accumulating sense among international travelers that the United States has become a more complicated, less welcoming destination than it used to be. The vacation spots on this list are real places with real things to offer. Las Vegas is still Las Vegas. New York is still New York. Yosemite is still one of the most beautiful places on the planet. The challenge is not the product. The challenge is everything that now surrounds the decision to visit. If you found this one valuable, hit like and subscribe. There's a lot more on what's happening to American tourism, where international travelers are going instead, and what it would actually take to bring them back.